but it also now, we got 40 million acres of a problem. What that was we started as farmers put livestock, I mean, what's the best use of grass? Put livestock on it. Well, it worked. It did work okay, but then their problems started happening. You can see these are the worst. These are the worst ones. Most of the time, it's just what's called summer slump. We'll talk about it later. They're just trying to cool themselves off. You know, they're just not great. You know, so they end up not performing as well as they could. But you know, some of the numbers that people are throwing out there, it looks like you know, back in 2004, and that was probably an underestimate by Freeberg and Waller at the University of Tennessee, about 600 million a year. Even using that in the Fescue belt, probably costing me about $79 a head, and that was a few years ago. I estimated that. You know, and I'm not an economist, but I can tell you, I can act like one, because you know what the difference between an economist and a dog at your back door? If you let the dog in, he'll quit whining. So I can whine with the best of them. So you just say that number, I'll stick to it, and I'll just whine about it. It's costing a lot of money, though, for sure. And of course, it was, as Matt mentioned, it was during this time that we started saying, well, what's causing this problem? We looked at a lot of things, and we went down some blind alleys for sure. But then finally, a guy, he was at Athens, Georgia, a guy named Charles Bacon, and there was some work being done in New Zealand at the same time with perennial ryegrass. We were starting to find out that there's a fungus that lives inside this plant that, you know, what we found out is just almost, you know, it's almost serendipity how they found out. They had some pastures at Auburn University that they didn't know were not infected, and the animals, they had two pastures. The animals were performing great over here, and over here they weren't performing well. And they went in there and they knew of Bacon's work, and they got Bacon to come look at that stuff, Charles Bacon, and he found that the ones that were doing real well for some reason didn't have the fungus. But yet they came from the same, they were Kentucky 31. And what they found was they had stored the seed wrong, and it killed the fungus, and actually it was the first source of fungus-free grass that they had. And when they compared the two, they said, oh man. And so this is that fungus. It's called Neotyphodium cinophyallum, for anybody that likes taxonomy, fungal taxonomy. But it's a fascinating organism. And we could talk all day just on the mutual. It's called a mutualism. These two organisms mutually derive some benefit from each other. So the fungus lives in there. It loves it. Got a nice host. In fact, it's actually turned its whole life cycle over to the plant. You know, most of the disease fungi that we look at for cereals and stuff, you know, they have to come out, form a reproductive body like a spores, and then they spread those spores and more plants get infected. This plant just lives in there. It doesn't even have a reproductive cycle. It perpetuates itself by going into the seed, and then the seed's replanted, and that's how so it's a very fascinating thing. But just know that this is what they found out, though, that this fungus was directly responsible when it's with the plant to doing things that we call producing a lot of alkaloids, but the main ones that we worry about is the ones that affect livestock, and that is the ergot alkaloids. They think that it's a group of alkaloids where the main problem, even though there's still some debate on that. So that's one reason I'm going to be using these things interchangeably, ergot alkaloids and ergovaline, but just know that they're just interchangeable right now in my view, because the highest percentage is ergovaline, and whether it's still the main thing, I don't know, but we've just decided to do all the ergots because there's several others in there. And ergot bodies are, you've probably heard about them, they can cause all kinds of problems in humans too. If you eat ergotized rye, you know, if you've heard about people eating ergotized rye, they get, well, it gets them all hepped up, because actually that ring is the LSD compound. So they can get, in fact, they think how Shakers and Quakers got their name was that they were eating a lot of ergotized rye, and then when they get in a religious stupor, they'd fall on the ground and shake and quake. So it's all kind of things going on here, but in fact, Timothy Leary, I think, actually I'm not sure about this, but I think he actually isolated the first LSD compounds from ergot bodies from rye, from cereal rye. But anyhow, it's a common compound, and it does produce it pretty good. As Matt showed you, you know, you say part per billion, that doesn't sound like a lot, but that's a lot. He's had some up there around 7,000. I mean, I did a lot of sampling. That is screaming. I don't know how they got the animals up and walked up, you know, could get them across the pasture. Mark, we had some animals we couldn't even get up with that kind of thing back in Georgia. And of course, I borrowed this slide from Matt. You know, they know it's a blood vessel constrictor. There's a lot of other things it does, and so, you know, is when you get that kind of constriction, you can have fescue foot. And of course, the main thing is they can't cool themselves off too. They tend. This is a more common problem. This is fairly unusual. Those big problems, I threw it out there to everybody get upset, but this is more common. You know, it's just a hot day, and you talk to farmers that you know, we're all human beings, and we tend to rationalize. You know, we great ration, and we can talk ourselves into anything. Is the best example I can give of that is that I was telling Chris this story last night. The best example I ever heard of that was two very educated people sitting at the same table, and in front of them was a bowl of fruit. And they're talking, and oh yeah, look at this fruit. This is really pretty, isn't it? He said, yeah. So one of them picks up a green pear. And he starts looking at it. He said, "This is a nice green pear." And he said, "Yeah." And he flips it around, a little yellow spot on that pear. And he says, "Look at that. That's a yellow spot. This might not be a green pear. It might just be a yellow pear that hadn't ripened yet." And the guy said, "Yeah, that's you're probably right." So he keeps talking, and then he keeps flipping that fruit, and he says, "You know, that's got an oblong shape. It doesn't really have a good pear shape, does it? It's kind of oblong in it." And he said, "You know, I think you're right. I think that does have an oblong shape." So they keep talking, and after a while he says, "You know, if that's an oblong shaped fruit and it's yellow, that might not be a pear. It might be a banana." And the guy said, "I believe you're right. That's a banana." So in a very logical and rational fashion, they just made a banana out of a green pear. And we do that a lot, don't we, as human beings? We come out and we see this, and we say, "It's a hot day, I'd be in the pond too." Well, that's only partially the reason they're in the pond. Most of the time they're in there to cool off because they can't dissipate heat. They've constricted their blood vessels, they can't dissipate heat. So it's building up a thermal problem for them. And then finally, you can get depressed prolactin levels. This is a very sensitive way to look at toxicity. I'll talk about it later. Again, I'm not an animal scientist. Mark's in there. I always have Mark to keep me straight. But I did stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night, so I can talk. But this is a little hard to see, but basically if you have a fungus-free, the blue and the green is a max Q, you can see blood prolactin levels crash within days, really. I mean, it just boom. If they get, and it doesn't take 7,000. I mean, we're talking about just a few hundred, and it's starting to crash. So the first symptoms are starting to show at very low levels, and then by the time you get to higher levels, then it's starting to affect the animals themselves. They're starting to stay in the ponds. They're not grazing. They're definitely not gaining, and they can, you know, if their exposure goes a long way, it can lead to real problems.